Morgan, let's talk about the big news here. The ETF, the Bitcoin ETF finally came through. You know, it's been in the works for years at this point. It seemed like Wall Street was always going to want to sort of get their grips on this, if you will. So the Bitcoin ETF is approved yesterday, Wednesday, January 10th, and it's now changing things pretty rapidly. Let's just start from a big picture analysis. I guess, what's your sort of viewpoint on this from a advisor standpoint?
Yeah, so as an advisor, this doesn't really affect my practice at all. So what I've tried to focus on I've been advising on Bitcoin basically since 2016. And what I've advised clients on is that we buy Bitcoin outright and we store it properly. And so to me, that's self-custody, and that we do that either in a single sig or a multi-sig solution. And the single sig or multi-sig is going to wildly depend on the client's situation and what does or does not make sense for them. And so to me, the ETF, while it doesn't really necessarily affect my practice or how we're going to do things going forward. Obviously, it does affect the industry going forward and how financial advisors are going to be approaching this. I think that my hope is that it's a stepping stone. My hope is that people allocate to Bitcoin through the ETF, and that they use this as a stepping stone to realize that, hey, maybe I want to figure out how this technology works now that, it's this multi-billion-dollar asset and so forth, and it's been around for 15 plus years, and it's now an ETF, and maybe this is something that's really worth more of my time. And so even though I've got this 1% or 2% allocation with my advisor, I'm now going to take it upon myself to buy Bitcoin outright and see how it works and so forth, and eventually I will be like all of Morgan's clients and take self-custody. That's my great hope. I wouldn't say I'm an optimist when it comes to thinking whether or not that will be what people actually do. I think that it's much more likely that most people get their assets parked in this ETF. They don't necessarily look at what it is or even think about having it in their portfolio. They just see it as a diversifier that their advisor told them is prudent for whatever reason, and they don't even give it a second thought. But there will be a percentage of people who do actually go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, so to speak. And that is beneficial, I think, because the more people who take self-sovereignty over their money, right, that's the whole point of this project, is that we start to remove these third parties, these trusted third parties, and we start to retake control of our money. And then we have, we're outside the purview of the government, government surveillance and so forth on all of our transactions. People have a right to that. And this is not like conspiracy theories, right? We obviously know that the government is looking at every single one of our transactions. Obviously, they're not, honed in on what Mark Moss is specifically doing or what Morgan Richard is specifically doing, right? But they could be if they wanted to be. And so I think just like it's un-American, obviously, and that for most people, right, even if they don't necessarily agree with like the libertarian utopia that we were talking about earlier, for most people, they still just want to live their lives and not be bothered by the government. And so I think that this adds to that project in a way that it's becoming more institutionalized, that this is something that's here and here to stay, and that the government necessarily isn't going to attack it, but it doesn't help move the project forward in the regard of people actually using Bitcoin the way it's meant to be used.
Yeah, so it helps them with their debasement of their savings, but doesn't really advance the project forward. I get messages all the time. I'm sure you do as well. I think yesterday I got one, and someone asked me specifically, I'm thinking about liquidating my entire 401k and paying a massive penalty and just putting the whole thing into Bitcoin. Do you think that's a good idea? Which, I can't really answer that question. But but in this type of environment with an ETF, they don't necessarily have to do that, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have to liquidate their entire 401k and pay a penalty. They could just now move some of that into Bitcoin now because there's an ETF solution for that, right?
Well, it depends, right? Because sometimes these 401k plans have specific investments that they're allowed to invest in. And so if the plan itself allows for Bitcoin investment, then obviously they could do that. If the plan doesn't, then they wouldn't be able to do that. They would still have to liquidate their 401k and pay the penalty and so forth. So I think it would depend on whether or not you're able to self-direct and so forth. But there are
a lot
ways
of those
for
able
people...
to be able to be converted over into a self-directed 401k?
Again, it's also going to depend on the plan and who is administrating the plan and so forth. So I'm sure, like I've seen Fidelity plans where that's where it's kind of open allocation or open architecture to allocate a certain percentage of your 401k, but not the whole thing to be self-directed. Other options that people have would be like if they separated from an employer to roll it over into an IRA and not take the penalty, and then work with a company like Unchained Capital or so forth to set up like a collaborative custody multi-sig IRA and so forth. And obviously there are going to be fees associated with doing that, but then you're holding Bitcoin the right way. So the avenues are available, but the penalty would still apply just depending on whether or not the 401k itself is allowing for the ETF.
Okay, so just because there's an ETF doesn't mean that your 401k will have access to it.
Yeah,
Because it
definitely.
has
And I would say, if anything, it will probably mean that people will not have access to it for a while because there are all sorts of rules and regulations that govern 401k plans. And most 401k providers are going to take a conservative approach to what they do and don't allow their participants to invest in.
And a lot of the 401k stuff is managed. I mean, it's what we just talked about. So it's not self-managed, it's managed for you. So they're the ones that are sort of dividing that up and divvying that up and making your investments for you. So it's sort of like, I'm asking a question, but is it sort of like where that plan administrator at some point, and it might be years from now, would decide that he wants to bring Bitcoin into the allocation and then you get it that way?
Well, so generally pensions work more like that, where there are actually like a money manager that chooses the asset allocation based on actuarial assumptions about who is in the plan. The 401k plans are what's called defined contribution. And so what the plan administrator does is they pick what people are allowed to invest in the plan, but they don't pick the allocation. The person themselves, they decide like how much money they're going to put into the plan and then how they're actually going to invest that money. Generally, what the plan administrator does is they set some sort of allocation in one of these target date style funds that's based on your age and when they think you're going to retire, and they force you into that. And then the onus is on the participant to go in there and actually change their asset allocation based on what other funds are available.
Okay. So maybe not a big influx from people that are already in these traditional vehicles, the 401ks, et cetera, because of different rules and regulations that are there.
Yeah, I would say like the IRA crowd is going to benefit more because the IRA crowd, like they didn't want to take maybe their assets out of their IRA and pay the penalty, or they didn't want to, or they didn't know about a company like Unchained Capital, or don't want to do something like that because it seems risky, and so they would benefit from the ETF for sure. And I mean, there's trillions of dollars in these IRA style plans, so I mean, but the ETF will benefit from that.
You told me before we started recording that some of the Bitcoin financial planners were being, I don't know, investigated or coming after you, something like that. I don't know if you want to touch on that briefly, but also, do you think that now with this sort of more institutional adoption with ETFs sort of takes some of that pressure off?
Yeah, I kind of wonder. So the CFP Board of Enforcement, so I'm a member of CFP Board just because I have the CFP designation. I've been a member since 2016. And we have a website called the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network. There's like 7 or 8 of us on there. And basically what we do is we help clients buy Bitcoin outright and take self-custody for the most part, or we just work with clients who want to own Bitcoin in some capacity. And so prior to obviously the ETF being issued, right, this is not something that financial advisors could touch. And so we created this network to be just sort of a directory where people can find people like me who are very happy and willing to help people who are interested in Bitcoin. The CFP board found the website and decided for whatever reason that we may or may not be doing something that they agree with. We actually don't have that much information on what it is that they are suspecting is wrong about the network, other than the fact that we all advise on Bitcoin. And so they asked some questions that I felt personally were not were beyond the scope of what was allowable for them to ask, like not specific client information, but like just kind of wondering about clients' asset allocation and so forth, and how they store Bitcoin in my practice, and like what my role in that is. And so I responded very kind of tersely that, you know, this information is confidential, and so give me more information about what you're looking for, and maybe we'll give you more information, type of a thing. We all submitted our responses last week, and we're still waiting to hear back from the CFP board about what they're going to do with that information and what they're going to do with us. But so far it's been a pretty poorly done investigation, I would say, because they asked for publicly available information from a lot of us, and they also got my gender incorrect. So I thought that was kind of funny that they didn't even go on the website to see whether or not I was a man or a woman, and just called me Mr. Rochard. So maybe they're actually after Pierre and not me.